the squid was gone. This strategy was so effective that evolution passed it on to almost every cephalopod alive today, from the tiny market squid on your dinner plate to the octopus hiding in a reef. Nearly all of them still carry an ink sac. It became the factory standard safety feature of the group, but there is one major exception. For squids living past the midnight zone, ink is basically useless. It's like throwing a smoke grenade into a dark closet. It does nothing. Biologically, it's a complete waste. And if you're a giant deep-sea squid, you're simply too big to hide anyway. When you're the size of a minivan, a small puff of ink isn't going to fool a giant sperm whale that wants to eat you. Because of this, most deep-sea squids eventually lost the ink sac altogether. At least that means modern krakens aren't blasting ink clouds around the ocean. Strangely enough, the shelled krakens are still the largest krakens we know of, because shell-less krakens were just huge masses of soft tissue. Their remains would have completely decomposed long ago. A giant blob of squishy material isn't going to survive in the fossil record for more than a few years, let alone thousands, millions, or hundreds of millions. There have been rumors of other giant, shell-less krakens, but most of them have been debunked or scaled down. One of these was Diese. If you saw it, you'd probably think that's just a giant squid. It grew up to about 25 feet long, which is still enormous. But surprisingly, it wasn't a squid at all. It was actually a vampiromorph, meaning it was more closely related to octopuses and today's vampire squid than to giant squids. Even so, being 25 feet long didn't make it the top predator. The ocean it lived in was basically a hell aquarium filled with monsters like bulldog fish, Sactinus, and the Jinjo shark. We know Diese had a rough existence because of one specific fossil, basically the prehistoric version of a turducken. Paleontologists found a 5-foot-long predatory fish called semoliches that had died with the remains of a Diese perfectly preserved inside its rib cage. The fish had tried to swallow the kraken whole, tail first, and realized far too late that the squid was just too thick to fit. The squid's head and tentacles were likely still hanging out of the fish's mouth, blocking its gills. The fish couldn't swallow it, and it couldn't spit it out either. So both of them died. Because of that, Diese doesn't go down in history as a legendary monster, but as a meal that was just slightly too big. There is one last kraken that needs to be mentioned, mostly because so many of you have asked about it. But fair warning, this one is highly speculative. This is the Triassic kraken, and if it were real, it would be by far the largest cephalopod to ever exist. The idea began when a paleontologist named Mark McMenamin examined a graveyard of giant ichthyosaurs in Nevada. These ichthyosaurs, called Shanosaurus, were 50-foot-long marine reptiles, basically the sperm whales of their time. In one specific location, 9 of them were found dead, and not just dead, but arranged. McMenamin proposed that a gigantic 100-foot-long octopus had been catching these massive reptiles, drowning them, and dragging them back to its lair. There it supposedly arranged their vertebrae into deliberate patterns. The proposed pattern resembled octopus suckers. Octopuses today are known to build middens, piles of shells and debris, outside their dens. McMenamin suggested this wasn't trash at all, but a kind of self-portrait made from bones. Octopuses are incredibly intelligent, ranking alongside animals like orcas and great apes, with only humans clearly above them. But was this real? Probably not. The strongest argument against it is also the simplest: currents. When long spinal columns decay, they naturally break apart and settle in lines shaped by water flow. What looks arranged may just be physics doing its job. Critics also pointed out a brutal flaw. Triassic cephalopods likely had only one row of suckers, not two. So if this kraken was making a self-portrait with double rows of bones, it was a terrible artist. Even if the Triassic kraken wasn't real, it remains a fascinating idea. Soft-bodied animals like squids are some of the hardest creatures to study in prehistory because almost nothing of them fossilizes. Still, size limits do exist. We can't just claim a mile-long kraken existed simply because we can't prove it didn't. So, why isn't there a modern version of these shallow water monsters? Why do today's krakens live only in the deep sea, far from the surface and our boats? Because the modern ocean is the worst possible place for a kraken to exist. The top of the food chain is no longer ruled by brute force, it's ruled by intelligence. A giant, mile-long squid would have to deal with sperm whales, which are basically living anti-squid torpedoes. They dive deeper than almost any other mammal and hunt using echolocation. If you're not in the deep, things get even worse. You'd be easy prey. And if sperm whales didn't get you, orcas would. A giant kraken would be one of the easiest meals they'd ever have, assuming it wasn't truly a mile long. And then there's the final boss, us. The modern ocean is loud, crowded, and industrial. A creature that large couldn't exist without hitting fishing nets, getting struck by cargo ships, or being deafened by military sonar. It would have nowhere to hide. Humans already dream about hunting krakens with harpoons. There is zero chance we'd allow a real sea monster to attack modern ships. Still, the fact that evolution created some version of the kraken at least 3 separate times proves one thing: the ocean really wants monsters to exist, and again it chooses cephalopods to make them. Let's just hope whatever is still down there isn't making art out of whale bones yet. We've always been told that the kraken is just a legend, a myth made up by terrified sailors who probably just saw a dying giant squid near the surface and then let their imaginations run wild. But 200 million years ago, krakens were actually real and they had shells. While the true origin of the kraken isn't fully known, almost everyone agrees that it likely came from some sort of cephalopod sightings. Estimates for the kraken vary wildly, ranging from around 50 meters, which is still enormous, to entire miles in length, a size that would collapse even the largest warships. Today, while we can confidently say that mile-long tentacled monsters don't exist, giant cephalopods absolutely do, or at least once did. Massive cephalopods existed long before giant or colossal squids ever appeared. However, they didn't look like the giant octopus figures we imagine today. If you traveled back to the Ordovician period, around 450 million years ago, you would witness the first known case of cephalopod gigantism in Earth's history. These enormous creatures were called orthocones, often referred to as the earliest true krakens. They reached lengths of nearly 23 feet, with some estimates suggesting they were even longer. And if you've seen discussions on prehistoric gigantism, you'd know that despite their strange appearance, they were apex predators. It's ironic because when people think of a giant squid today, they imagine the ultimate deep-sea monster. In reality, modern giant squids are more like large, highly stressed snacks. Despite reaching lengths of up to 40 feet, both giant and colossal squids sit well below the top of the food chain. They are a primary food source for sperm whales. Without a hard, pointed shell to protect them, they're essentially oversized calamari. And while they may technically be longer than orthocones, that doesn't mean they were larger overall. Much of a giant squid's length comes from its long, trailing tentacles. In contrast, the actual body mass of large orthocones, such as Camarasaurs, may have been nearly double that of a giant squid. So, why do modern-day krakens look so different? The answer lies in biology. Modern giant squids are constrained by their physiology. They must remain in the cold, deep midnight zone because their blood struggles to carry oxygen in warmer waters. They're built for a very specific, quiet existence, one where every moment is a game of hide and seek, with life or death consequences. They aren't rulers of the ocean. They're more like high-ranking middle managers of the deep. But 450 million years ago, orthocones didn't face sperm whales. They didn't face sharks. They faced almost no threats at all except each other. Orthocones engaged in significant cephalopod cannibalism because the only thing more dangerous than a giant Camarasaurs was an even larger one. This sparked a literal size war where survival of the fittest meant survival of the biggest cone. Of course, carrying a massive, rigid, rock-hard shell came with serious drawbacks. It created weaknesses, but at the time, there was nothing capable of exploiting them. You might also assume such a shell would make swimming nearly impossible, causing them to sink and embed themselves in mud like underwater lawn darts. But orthocones had a secret weapon: physics. Inside their enormous shells were chambers connected by a tube called a siphuncle. By pumping gas or water in and out of these chambers, they could control their buoyancy with remarkable precision. They were essentially living balloons. To rise, they added gas. To descend onto unsuspecting prey and crush it with their 800-pound mass, they added water. This is the same principle modern submarines use today, except nature solved it over 400 million years ago using calcium and biology. So, if they were apex predators larger than great white sharks and equipped with natural submarine technology, why aren't they ruling the oceans today? Why is the Kraken now reduced to a soft, shell-less squid? The answer is simple: turning. Imagine trying to parallel park a bus. Now, imagine doing it underwater, using only your face to steer. That was life. As an orthocone, they could move forward quickly and reverse just as fast, but turning that rigid shell was a nightmare. They were the drag racers of the ancient oceans, and it worked perfectly until it didn't. Evolution eventually introduced something that exploited this flaw. Fish. Jawed fish first appeared around 520 million years ago. The first krakens emerged roughly 480 million years ago. Once fish capable of biting evolved, including early sharks, these awkward giants stood little chance. And so, the original krakens slowly died out. For millions of years afterward, the ocean had no true kraken, only fish, reptiles, and countless creatures devouring one another. Each other. But a relatively short time later, around 300 million years ago, the shelled krakens finally returned. This time, however, they had to evolve or suffer the same fate as before because sharks were still dominating the seas. So, instead of growing a long, straight cone, they coiled their shell into a massive spiral like an enormous cinnamon roll. This creature was Parapuzosia, and if we're being technical, it has the best claim to the title of the true kraken. While orthocones were long and modern, colossal squids are, well, colossal. Parapuzosia holds the record for the largest single cephalopod to ever exist. In Earth's history, Parapuzosia was an ammonite, the largest ammonite ever discovered. If you think, ammonites are just those cute little fossils sold in museum gift shops, think again. This thing was over 8 feet, across just in shell diameter. That's a shell taller than shack rolling through the ocean. Again, it wasn't technically longer than most giant squids, but that's only because squids have long trailing tentacles. In terms of raw mass, the actual amount of cephalopod making up the body, Parapuzosia wins by a huge margin, while a modern colossal squid, the heaviest invertebrate alive today, tops out around 1,000 to maybe 1,300 pounds. Estimates for Parapuzosia put it at over 3,000 pounds. By coiling their shell, these krakens became far more compact and maneuverable than the clumsy orthocones. They could spin, turn, and pivot. In other words, they upgraded from a bus to a tank. Unfortunately for them, the ocean had upgraded too. Parapuzosia lived at the same time as mosasaurs, giant marine lizards with bite forces rivaling a T-Rex. Fossils of these enormous ammonites have been found with massive bite marks punched clean through their shells. Krakens weren't invincible. Everything around them had leveled up in size as well. In reality, they were probably only mid-level predators, not true apex hunters. But the big question everyone wants answered is this: could one take on a modern kraken? Imagine dropping a colossal squid and a Parapuzosia into the same ocean, assuming both could survive the radically different environments. Let's play that out. From a physics standpoint, the ammonite has a huge advantage. It's a 3,000-pound ball of rock. If a colossal squid tried to wrap its tentacles around the shell, it would be almost useless. Weight matters enormously in brute force fights, and in nature it often decides the outcome. The rotating hooks on a colossal squid's tentacles are terrifying against soft flesh, but against solid calcium, it would be like trying to climb a marble wall with ice picks. You just slide off, and the ammonite's beak was built specifically to crush armor. If it got hold of a squid's tentacle, it would shear it off. However, the colossal squid has the ultimate advantage: intelligence. Ammonites were, to put it politely, simple. They were closer to a nautilus than an octopus. They weren't solving problems, they were just floating and eating. A colossal squid, on the other hand, is a true squid. It's smart, reactive, and equipped with high-speed jet propulsion. It wouldn't try to wrestle the shell. It would flank, using its massive eyes to spot a blind angle, zip around the back, where the ammonite turns slowly, and go straight for the soft face exposed at the front. If the ammonite retreated fully into its shell, the fight would end in a stalemate, but if it tried to engage, the squid would likely win 9 times out of 10 by being faster, smarter, and not burdened by a 3,000-pound backpack. The ammonite might win with a lucky grab, or simply by sitting on the squid, but those odds aren't great. That said, these two animals would never have met. Parapuzosia wasn't a deep-sea creature, and they were separated by millions of years. While giant ammonites were dying out, a much sneakier group of cephalopods was experimenting with something radical. These were the coleoids, the ancestors of modern squids and octopuses. They were the first to abandon the shell entirely. They either shrank it down or absorbed it inside their bodies to act as internal support, like the cuttlebone found in modern cuttlefish. By becoming soft and shell-less, they became fast. They could use jet propulsion without dragging a 3,000-pound limestone house behind them. But being soft in an ocean full of teeth is a terrible idea unless you have a backup plan. So they invented chemical warfare, the ink sac. We even have fossils from the Jurassic period, such as belemnites, where soft tissue was preserved well enough for scientists to identify the ink sac. This changed everything. Before ink, if a predator spotted you, your options were limited: fight or be harder to eat than the animal next to you. With ink, you could disappear. It was the biological equivalent of a smoke grenade. A predator attacks, boom, its face is full of melanin and mucus. By the time it clears its vision, the prey is gone.